Hi and welcome to the podcast, everyone. I'm your host, Garima, and today we have the privilege of speaking with an industry leader whose expertise spans both chemical and cannabis testing sectors. Joining me today is Dr. Susan Audino, the founding partner of Saturn Scientific and a principal at Audino Associates. She has been issued several US patents. She's a renowned chemist and chemometrician and an independent consultant to chemical and biological laboratories. On behalf of accreditation bodies, she assesses laboratories and is an instructor for multiple ISO-IC standards such as ISO 17025. Dr. Audino is a prominent figure in the cannabis industry, leading the development of official and consensus test methods. She is a trusted member of expert review panels and serves as a scientific advisor to various cannabis testing laboratories, both private and non-profit, as well as state regulatory bodies. Her impressive credentials also include chairing the AOAC Cannabis Advisory Panel and analytical cannabis working groups, contributing to the NCIA Guide for Laboratory Testing, and being a faculty member of Teachable Medicine. She's a highly sought-after speaker at conferences. Her deep understanding of laboratory standards combined with her leadership in the cannabis testing community make her an invaluable voice on today's topic. And trust me, from the interactions that I've had with Susan Audino, you are in for a treat. Dr. Audino, welcome to the show, and it's an honor to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm beyond flattered by such an introduction. Thank you very much, and thank you for your kind words, and really thank you for the humbling opportunity to be here with you today. And so I appreciate that very much.
Thank you so much, Susan Audino. Dr. Audino, before we talk about some of the deeper issues surrounding cannabis testing and the tools that can help us address them, it would be good to start with the basics, especially for some of our listeners who might not be very familiar with the cannabis industry. Now, one of the key pieces of information that both consumers and regulatory bodies rely on when it comes to cannabis testing is the certificate of analysis. Could you explain to our listeners what a certificate of analysis is and why it is so important in the cannabis industry?
Sure. Sometimes the certificate of analysis is also referred to as a test report. It's basically the foundation of what becomes a label on a product. Before we can put a label on a product, we need to understand what's in there, right? The what's in there come from the results of laboratory testing. And these results are summarized in a report that tells the reader about that sample. So what work was performed on that sample or that batch of samples. The purpose of all of that is to make sure that the laboratory's owner can tell you exactly what was tested, how it was tested, when it was tested, who tested it, what were those specific results, and then to include what are referred to as statements of conformity. And those are decisions to pass or fail, or to make a statement about in specification or out of specification if they are required. Interestingly enough, some clients really don't want a certificate of analysis. They just say, hey, tell me what's in there. But most cannabis regulatory bodies really insist that all testing is accompanied by a certificate of analysis or a test report, however they're named, or some other formal report between the lab and the owner of the sample. For those labs that are accredited to 17025, there are many options that are available. Unless there's a regulatory restriction, lab personnel have the option to talk with the client and say, okay, how much information do you really want on this COA? And how much do you not want on there? Tell us what you want. How do you want us to deliver it to you? Would you like it to be delivered on hard paper, by QR code, by you logging into your account here? What do you want to do? So basically, there are a lot of alternate ways for the laboratory to communicate the test results to the client. But sadly, I have seen 100% irrefutable proof certificates of analysis that have been manipulated. So the natural question is, well, what does that mean? Well, for whatever reason, usually a self-serving reason, some people have falsified the certificates of analysis, which I'm just going to call COAs, to meet their own needs. So, for example, undesirable data may be crossed out or deleted and perhaps replaced with something more desirable, or maybe even left blank. I've also seen cases where the entire laboratory name has been deleted from the report and replaced with a fake laboratory name. So clearly we need to be very cautious. Those COAs or test reports are beyond essential to us, right? They're a critical pathway between their sale and the consumer. Unfortunately, there's a lot of unscrupulous behavior out there, and that compromises all of us and removes our right to make educated decisions. So to put that in perspective, can you imagine what your life would be like if you picked up a package of food or prescribed medicine, a bottle of soda, pet food, or animal feed? You name the commodity, and the ingredients are missing or misrepresented. Here's a little less known fact, but very often state or federal agencies will test previously tested products. That they go in and they take them off the shelves and they test them to ensure that the label ingredients are correctly reported. Overall, these are ingredients that are the cornerstone of the marketplace, and our confidence in that ingredient label is paramount, and the foundation of that is the COA.
Right. Dr. Audino, like you already said, there has been irrefutable evidence that some COAs or test reports are being manipulated. Could you share some common methods of COA fraud that you've observed, and how do these fraudulent activities impact public health, regulatory compliance, and the overall reputation of the cannabis industry?
Sure. Honestly, I'm always quite surprised by the creativity and the energy people put into manipulating those COAs. It's absolutely incredible to me. And I sit there and I scratch my head and I think, boy, now that's creative. I ran across a fraudulent COA and it was just really obvious. In particular, there was a specific pesticide residue that was listed and it had a little asterisk on it. Now, we know that whenever we see an asterisk on something, anything, we go to the bottom of the page to say, what is it referring to, right?
Right.
So I did that. So there's this pesticide residue with an asterisk. The result was blank. Okay, meaning there was no data there. Sounds pretty innocuous, but when I followed that asterisk trail down to the bottom of the test report, there was a statement that said something like, does not meet regulatory specification. So you sit there and you say, but it's blank. There's nothing there. And that would mean that the pesticide residue had been tested and it was found to be bad or exceeded the regulatory specification limit. And so it failed, right? So historically, when something like that fails, you can't sell it or it's taken off the market or some other activity happens. So at first glance, the COA seemed pretty fine, but it isn't until you actually follow down that little trail and realize, maybe there is a problem here. So that was one that was clearly manipulated by the owner of that product or somebody else. I've also seen reports where data are incorrectly reported. For example, if something is tested and reported to be, let's say, 2%, and all of a sudden becomes 12% or 24%. Or how about a COA some COAs have pictures of the products that have been tested on that report. And what happens when the picture on that COA doesn't match the description? So what that means is that if you see a picture of, let's say, a concentrate, but the description says this flower, so clearly the description in there doesn't match the picture. So that's usually a pretty good indicator that the COA has been manipulated or is fraudulent. So that means that we have to go back and look up the original and go back to the original testing lab. And then what I saw in those cases is that somebody had hijacked a legitimate COA for his or their own use. And by hijacking, they took a legitimate COA and made some changes to it to fit their needs. So, it's just kind of interesting. The next logical question is, why would somebody want to do that? Well, I think it could be for any number of reasons. So it could be that the producer wanted to save money, or the producer had a product known to be in violation, and this was a way to get it on the shelves. But in the end, the COAs look pretty good, definitely realistic, but they're 100% fraudulent. In fact, during a recent conference, I put a bunch of COAs in front of very highly qualified and experienced scientists who are used to seeing these things all the time. And they were not able to easily distinguish the authentic from the fraudulent COAs. So that's, just the extent to which they go. It's just wrong. As consumers, our lives really depend on our confidence in the labels of the products that we're buying. And again, those labels are generated by the test reports. Think about a very current event. Have you heard about the E. coli breakout with hamburger, right? How do we know that there's an E. coli breakout? Well, by testing, be it random or planned. And so this sort of testing occurs with all products. Again, pet food, animal feed, livestock feed, human food. Cannabis is really no different than any other commodity, especially no other agricultural commodity. And, make no mistake, I'm not so naive as to think that this fraudulent behavior doesn't exist in other industries. I'm sure that it does. But the representation is not always as blatant or as prolific as it is in the cannabis industry. And in the cannabis industry, we're still a very new, very young, very nascent industry, learning how to walk on our own 2 feet and trying to self-regulate. Clearly, we have some issues. Not too long ago, I was doing some research on cannabis flower, and I went into a legitimate, legally licensed dispensary, and I asked for a product that was high in Delta-9 THC. I also asked for the COA. And so this gentleman gives me this box of material, and he says, well, here, this is what you're looking for. And I said, well, I'm still looking for the COA. And I glanced at the box label, and I said, well, and I'd also asked for something with high THC. And he says, well, why do you care about the COA? And I said, well, because I want to see what's in there. And I looked at the box a third time, and I said, I don't see any THC in here. And maybe you pulled the wrong product for me. And he says, well, it's in there. It's called THCA. And I said, well, that's not the same as THC. And he said, well, yes, it is. I said, no, it's really not. And he said, well, yes, it really is. And so we went this banter back and forth for a little while. And I even disclosed to him that I was a chemist in the cannabis industry. And he advised me that he had been a bud tender for about 5 years. And he graciously invited me to go to Google to educate myself on what is and is not THC and what is and is not cannabis. And so I look at that, and for a moment I was really quite incredulous there for a good 30, 40 seconds. And I thought, well, I'm just going to walk away from this. And I realized that in that moment, just how dangerous that is, right? I know what I'm talking about. I really do know what I'm talking about when I go in there and I'm looking at these products. What my heart goes out to are people who are not scientists, people who are not in the cannabis industry, people who are trusting bud tenders like this and trusting what's on that label before they buy something, especially that this is not a federally regulated industry. So the risk is even higher. And now we have labels that are just clearly wrong. And we have people selling these products that don't know what they're talking about. And that's a recipe for a problem. That disconnect can be very dangerous to the consumer. And again, It comes down to that COA.
Exactly. So it's striking but not uncommon to see something as important as a COA being manipulated in ways that undermine public trust and regulatory compliance. And your comparison to product labels in other industries highlights just how much consumers rely on accurate information for their health and safety. Now, while regulators are well intentioned in their efforts to ensure end user safety, and most product manufacturers and laboratories are striving to maintain the highest standards, the cannabis industry, Dr. Audino, continues to face significant challenges. Challenges like THC inflation, litigation, and disparaging mudslinging. So, could you help us understand the factors contributing to these challenges?
It's a very gentle way of talking about some of those challenges. So, but yes, there is a lot of mudslinging going around. And before I go any further, I have to warn you that I actually find a lot of benefit and a lot of value in academic arguments because it offers an opportunity to learn. It is an opportunity for colleagues to sit down and debate one thing or another and to have these discussions. And without academic arguments, they're really just fundamental discussions. Without those arguments and discussions, science will never, ever advance. Our advancements in science are because we challenge one another all the time. Not a single one of us knows everything. And so the only way we learn is to talk with folks who have different opinions and different positions. And that being said, I actually have colleagues who I personally and professionally respect a great deal, and we have disagreements about this very topic. Personally, I think the conversations are enlightening. So for quite some time, I have held very strong to my opinion that no single entity is the culprit for the current difficulties or state of the cannabis testing. I am committed to my longstanding belief that regulators are well-intentioned, but this is only one side of the coin. The other side of their coin is that a lot of the regulations simply lack scientific justification. They just simply don't make sense. In some cases, the regulations actually contradict what's in our textbooks and what we're taught in school. So a two-sided coin just on the regulations. Again, one side being exceptionally well-intentioned. I think that they need to be there. So I would agree that this creates a bit of a bottleneck for the problems here, but it's really not the entire source of the problem. So if we move to the next entity, let's talk about laboratories for a minute. So I'm happy to report that I've never met a new laboratory owner or prospective lab owner that has said, I want to be a jerk and manipulate data and put out bad stuff. I've never met one of those. They all start off the same with the assertion to provide a valuable and trustworthy service to the customer. And I've met some folks who have said, I really want to feel good about helping people, and owning a lab is a good way and a helpful way to do that. I want them to have trust in the product that they're receiving. So just as the regulators, these laboratory owners start their journeys also very well-intentioned. And in the end, they need to keep their lights on, pay their bills, and pay their staff, and pay their very expensive instruments. So let's put that on pause for a second. What is the next big industry? Who else has skin in this industry, right? How about the product manufacturers who start their enterprises to make products to help customers, help their consumers? They often say things like, I'm only going to make really good products because I want to help people. I'm a patient, my friend is, my aunt is, my mother, my 90-year-old grandparents like these products. And so I want to make sure we get good products to people who need them and who want them. Their goal is to get the products on the shelf, often spending tens of thousands of dollars to make that happen. But in order for them to successfully accomplish their mission, they have to first navigate a lot of regulatory hoops, which require laboratory testing. So even if we just consider these three players, and there are more, there are definitely more out here in this industry, but these are three main players. Where are we? Well, we end up with this conversion of three well-intentioned entities with well-intentioned leaders and well-intentioned folks supporting them. And now we have customers who are well-intentioned entities, well-intentioned people. It all sounds really good to me, but how it's playing out is not always ideal. For example, the product manufacturer sends samples to a lab for testing, which they have to do to ensure that the sample is within regulatory specifications. And then the laboratory advises the product manufacturer or customer accordingly. When the laboratory performs that test on a customer sample and determines that that sample fails to meet some specification, the laboratory then has to advise the customer that either the sample or the batch of samples have failed. And that means that the customer cannot sell that sample or that batch of samples, that that product is prohibited from hitting the shelves. So some customers take to telling the laboratory, I spent a lot of time, a lot of money, and made a big batch of this stuff. I need to get it on the shelf. Either you do something to make sure that my stuff passes, or I'm going to have to take my business elsewhere. And so let's think about the sequence here. Regulations don't always make sense, and in fact, some contradict basic chemistry and micro methods. Now, the laboratory wants to do the right thing, but they also want to make the customers happy because, well, they need to keep the laboratory in business. And the customer is obligated to meet specifications before putting that product on the shelf, and they lose money each day that there is a delay in that. So we have a very well-intentioned laboratory. They want to act black and white, yes, this is right. No, that's not right. Yes, this is inspect. Nope, you failed. So good versus evil, but they're now put in an awkward position, and they're in the opinion of, or they move to the opinion of, well, nothing is really ever black and white. Things are shades of gray. So we do a little bit of this in this gray zone and a little bit here. We'll go a little bit, we'll change this a little bit. We now make our margins of error bigger. That way we can tell the regulators, yeah, see, they're within regulation, and now the customer's happy. So they're making little modifications here and there. Everybody ends up being happy. And this is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but just one of the reasons why we hear things like potency inflation. I know that this is a pretty simplistic view, but I think it illustrates my opinion that the industry's problem are not the result of just any one body, right? It's not the customer's problem. It's not the product manufacturer. It's not the laboratory. It's not the regulation. It really is the result of a convergence of all of them. Now, on the other side, which is equally real, is that there really are bad players who make conscious decisions to manipulate data, manipulate science, manipulate the regulations, and we've seen that. And right now, there aren't many functional stop checks for those folks. The USDA saw this with their definition of hemp. And so we saw proliferation of synthetic materials, which were theoretically illegal, but because the definition of hemp was not specific enough, these other behaviors were allowed to happen, these other products were allowed to happen, and the exploitation was loud and clear. Fortunately, some labs, they're few and far between, refuse to operate in this little gray zone, and they say, no, you know what, I need to live with myself, I need to sleep with sleep at night. I'm only going to do good science with 100% integrity. And if I lose my customers, so be it, I lose my customers. And sadly, most of those laboratories have gone out of business, or they've moved to non-testing or testing non-cannabis commodities. So in the end, we have these two camps of laboratories testing cannabis, those that are really bad and those that are really super good and super effective. But for the most part, we have those that are in that gray zone. When they do work in that gray zone, one small change here, one small change there, propagate, and we end up with a bigger problem. But I find it kind of ironic that good labs are putting bad labs are putting the good labs out of business. That just doesn't make sense to me. So again, I think it's just the ebbs and flows and the convergence of all of the entities that are kind of rooting a lot of these challenges. I'm sorry, I know that was pretty long-winded.
No, not at all. That was pretty interesting. And thank you. It's clear that having to balance regulatory demands and satisfying customer demands puts labs in a difficult position. And as you mentioned, some laboratories, despite their best efforts to prioritize science, find themselves struggling to stay afloat amid labs that appear to manipulate results to satisfy customer needs. With that in mind, Dr. Audino, can you share some real-world examples of how laboratories might exploit the principles of analytical chemistry to meet customer needs, potentially at the expense of the accuracy of test results?
Sure. As a chemist, my opinions are rooted in chemistry. It comes back down to chemistry and science. And it's my opinion that one of the most egregious laboratory practices in a laboratory's decision to pass or fail a test result to some regulatory specification is based on a single value. So in part, that is the fault of the regulatory body. But anyway, I'll get back to that. So for example, by definition, something known as the limit of quantitation, or LOQ, is the lowest concentration that something can be reliably quantitated. So I can reliably say there's 10% in this, not 2%, not 12%, not 20%, but I can reliably say, test it over and over again and get a roughly 10%. So reliable is the operative word when we talk about limit of quantitation. But conformity to regulation standards simply make the laboratory make a decision on values that are less than that LOQ. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the laboratory must say, boy, this is under, this quantity is less than my LOQ, but now I have to stand behind that value, tell you whether it passes or fails, and then I am subjected to you testing it. And by golly, I hope you get the same number I get. But I know that my number is unreliable. So what this is telling us is that even if the regulations are telling us to make that decision and the laboratory makes that decision to pass or fail on the value, on basis of just that one value, nothing else, with no guardrails, means we can test that same sample later today and probably get a different result. You can test it tomorrow and get a different result. We can all test it at different times and get different results. And so that becomes a problem, because now I have one laboratory fighting with another laboratory saying, I got a different result from you. We have the regulatory body saying, we tested and we got a different result. And so the poor laboratory is stuck on the defensive, and they're like, but by definition, this is an unreliable number. But we don't hear that when we talk about regulations. Another place where I see a problem, and this is somewhat related, is that the laboratories are not putting guardrails around the test value. So we know that no measurement is ever perfect, right? If you're building a space shuttle, are you going to use a typical ruler in your household ruler? No, you want something that's really tight, right? Because everything has an error. Everything has a plus or minus. So do our test results. So this is different than how right is my test result, or how correct am I. If the true value is 10 and I test a 12, then my error is 2, whatever the units. Well, when I'm talking about guardrails, I'm talking about how confident am I in my test result. I say it's a 12. How confident am I that it's a 12 and not an 11.5 or a 10? So I want to be able to say that my test result, I am 95% sure that this is my test result, but it can go within these guardrails. And that would provide everybody an opportunity to see, gee, this test result, which seems to be on just over the pass line, may pass, but it may also fail. Or something that we call a fail may actually be a pass, because we're at that unreliable line, or we're at that uncertainty line. So again, these guardrails are not asking how right am I, it's really getting around to the question of how confident am I in that result. And again, no measurement anywhere in this world is ever perfect. There's always error. And the third place where I see problems in laboratory are calibration curves. These are statistical applications to a bunch of numbers. So we'll, look at an area count versus a concentration, create an equation of that line, and solve for the concentrations in unknown samples. Calibration curves. We know these all the time. We refer to them often as linear regression, and they're more formally known as ordinary least squares. And Excel makes it all look super easy. You have your X column, your Y column, you highlight that, press a button, and poof, you get a grid, and you press a couple more buttons, and boom, you get a line, and you see how straight that line is. What we don't realize is that those are statistical models. They're not actually perfect relationships. They're just models. And the equation of that line used to calculate concentrations, for lack of word, is really just a correlation of some sort. It's called the correlation of determination. And it gives us something called an R-squared value. And that R-squared value of 1 means, oh, this is perfect, can't get any better. But we know that that rarely happens. So we're typically satisfied with something like an R-squared of 0.99939 or 49s. And I like to go into labs, and when I'm auditing a lab, I very frequently do this. I pull the raw data and I plot it, and I say, boy, you got 4 9s in here. It looks really good. But then I test the assumptions of the model using their data, and I see that the assumptions of that model fail. So if the assumptions of that model fail, then I don't have any confidence in that R-square or that line or that equation or the final concentration. So even if a lab gets an R-square of 0.9999999 and it does not meet the assumptions of that model, then it's a lousy fit. It doesn't work. It's not good, and we should not be using that. So a lot of laboratories don't really understand that. Again, they say, well, Excel does it, so it must be easy. And even worse to that point is when the linear regression doesn't work, they say, well, I'll use a quadratic fit or a polynomial fit because Excel gives those options to us. And those also have assumptions which are very different than what we're trying to do with linear regression. So all of these things, I think, are probably the biggest areas that I've encountered in the labs. Oh, and one final thing is sampling. Sampling in the real world is very different than what we're doing with sampling in the cannabis lab. So sampling is, we want to identify how much protein is in dog food. So we may go to the grocery store and sample 100 bags, 100 of the 50-pound bags of dog food and take smaller portions of that and analyze that. But in the cannabis industry, we could have as much as 50 pounds of flower material, but we're only allowed to sample about 50 grams, so really tiny portion, and then we're only testing even a fraction of that. Then we have to make assumptions about 50 pounds. So our issue is, even if the testing is fine, even if laboratories are doing their jobs exceptionally well and the regulations are great, if we don't have a good sample, then it's all irrelevant. So I see that a lot in the cannabis industry where the sampling is substandard, and therefore that sets the stage for end conclusions that are really irrelevant. Again, I'm sorry, long-winded. See, you get me going on these tangents. I might not stop.
I'm all ears, and we are all ears for that. So thank you. This helped me understand how important it is for laboratories to maintain scientific integrity, especially when measurements and statistical models do not always align with real-world conditions. That brings us to another critical point, which is accreditation. Now, while accreditation is seen as a seal of quality and reliability, it may not always guarantee that a lab adheres to the highest standards of scientific rigor. Having said that, can consumers trust accredited labs? And Could you help us understand the limitations of accreditation and the risks of associating and assuming all accredited labs are equally competent?
Sure. There are a couple of things about 17025 that we need to establish first and foremost. One is it's not a standard that was developed for the cannabis lab, so that needs to be abundantly clear. This is a standard that's been around for decades, and 17025 has been around for so long. It's one of about 60,000 standards issued by ISO, which is an international standard. 17025 in particular is that worldwide standard for third-party quality control testing laboratories and calibration laboratories. And its goal is to set the foundation for quality assurance. So some of the typical laboratories that are accredited to 17025 are things like the FDA, the USDA, the World Health Organization, CDC, the Departments of Health, private laboratories, calibration laboratories, thousands and thousands and thousands of labs out there. So 17025 is really setting this basis for the quality assurance that the laboratory has to follow. Certain requirements like, let's see, does the laboratory have a system that you can make sure that you understand the procedures and policies? Does the foundation include staff training to make sure that people are performing their work competently? Does the information on the certificate of analysis represent what you did? Are you retaining your data? Can you establish a document trail? Can you establish an audit trail of your results? Are you looking at your data to ensure there are no trends? These are all things that the laboratories have to comply with in order to defend the validity of their test results. So every ISO 17025 laboratory has undergone an assessment by an independent external third party that says, not only do you have this quality assurance foundation, you are also technically competent to perform this work on your very specified scope of accreditation. You may have 100 things that you're doing in the lab, but you're only accredited to this one. We are attesting to your competence to perform that one method. We're not really paying attention to the other 99 that you may be doing in the lab. Now, what's interesting about this is that it is a standard about the competence of the lab to perform the work, but that work doesn't necessarily have to be the best science that's out there. So very often I have to review methods that I don't believe to be the best science out there. However, the laboratory is competent to perform that work that's on their scope. So it's a struggle, it's a balance. The idea behind 17025 accreditation and the designation of being an accredited laboratory essentially means that laboratories can provide that accreditation to attest to their competence by an independent third party, and that gives confidence in their customers. So if I see that there is a 17025 laboratory out there, I might turn around and say, oh, they've been assessed, they know what they're doing, they're competent, I have confidence in them. So that's the strength of 17025. That's all good. The downside of that, which I've mentioned, is that the competence doesn't necessarily mean that it is the best science that's out there. Then, there's also this fact that there's no guarantee people are going to follow it. We have absolutely no guarantee that if I do an assessment today, which I granted as a sampling exercise, I do an assessment today and you are running a spot-on, pristine laboratory with exceptional compliance, doing great work, there's no guarantee that tomorrow you're going to say, oh, well, that was all just for show and tell. Let me go do what I want to do. customers, the public doesn't really know that. We don't really know when that's happening. So they may be an accredited laboratory, and that gives us some assurance as to the competence of the laboratory. Whether or not they choose to competently and appropriately perform that work, nobody can guarantee. It's really up to the laboratory, their own consciousness and their consciences to do the right thing. So, part two of all of this is that if there's a method that's not on their scope, we have to be aware that we are asking them to do work for those methods that show up on their scope that have been evaluated, and be sure that the laboratory is not claiming that same status for methods that are not on their scope. So we have those two things. So two things. One is the foundation of quality assurance, competence, and choosing to work competently, we can't guarantee. And then there is the scientific foundation of those methods. Obviously, there are a lot of methods out there. Some are better than others. You can measure THC in many different ways. There are some that are great and others that are not very good. And if a lab wants to put a not very good method on their scope, my job is to go in and make sure that they're competent to perform that method. And even as an assessor, I can't go in and say, well, you know what, you're competent to do this method, but your method really is bad. It's not my role. It's not my job. And as a consumer, as a customer of those laboratories, I need to be sure I'm asking the right questions when I'm contracting with those laboratories to do that work. But again, at the end of the day, there's never an absolute guarantee that people are going to do the right thing. And in the cannabis industry, we've had example after example after example where people are choosing to do the wrong thing, even though they are accredited.
Right. Thanks for the explanation. So accreditation is crucial, but it's clear it doesn't always guarantee the best science or consistent practices. With these limitations, consumer trust becomes even more important. And this brings me to the role of technology in building that trust. How do informatics tools, in your opinion, help authenticate results and enable consumers to verify the composition stated on product labels?
Sure. Laboratories have a lot of stuff going on all at one time. We get one sample in and we spread it out around the laboratory, and so it's been partitioned out, and who's doing what, doing test method A on part of it, test method B on part of it. So lots of moving parts in a laboratory all the time. So we need to rely on informatics to help ease that burden and help make that process and make that flow easier to manage, easier to understand, easier to call up on. And so I look at informatics like CloudLIMS providing a huge opportunity for improvement and efficiency in the laboratory and for document retrieval, because we need to follow our procedures. If we don't have the procedure in front of us, how do we follow the procedure to the T? Having paper on a desktop is very cumbersome. We don't really want to say that, and we also really don't want to say, well, I don't really need to follow this procedure because it's not in front of me, or where is it? So having electronics and touchpads and laptops available to us is exceptionally helpful, and having the informatics is, again, the access point to that functionality in the laboratory. Again, many moving parts to the lab. The laboratory space is at a premium, and so we want to maintain efficiency as best as possible. And a lot of times informatics allows us to do some thinking for us. Oh, yeah, I have to go down this next step. And it provides a great guide. Then there are times when we are providing some quality control samples or laboratory control samples to make sure our processes are working. But if those quality control samples are outside limits, so we think, oh my gosh, this quality control sample failed, that means it puts all of my customer samples at risk of failing. What shall I do? Well, we need to be able to flag those. And so informatics will often flag those for us in process so we don't waste 5 hours when we can cut to the chase and say, oh, 20 minutes into the scheme, we have a problem. Let me stop here, figure out what's going on. We are relying on those checkpoints. We also have things like QR codes out there, and being able to trace things back to a QR code or a barcode, again, helps us to stop in our tracks and immediately go back to the checkpoint that we are interested in without having to do literally hours of manual labor and review to get to where we need. So informatics, when they're used appropriately, can and do provide an incredible benefit to the laboratories. The dynamics of the laboratory become very difficult to manage without them.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Audino. Thank you for those insights. Now, shifting our focus to the broader regulatory landscape, how do current regulatory frameworks affect the integrity of testing and reporting in the cannabis industry? And do you think there are certain regulations that need reform?
I think that we do need reform. Yes, I think reform is needed all around. Again, I come back to what I said about 30 or 40 minutes ago, in that I do not believe there is only one entity that bears the burden of all of these challenges. I do believe it's a big playground, and we need to get all of the players involved in that. We need to get all of the entities sitting there and in evaluating and talking to one another and understanding how all of the pieces to the puzzle come together. But we have to first get the pieces to the puzzle together, identified individually, before we can start to assemble them. No one person, no one body, not even the regulatory body, is solely responsible for the success of this industry. We need to take an educated reform that is practical and that takes all of the factions into consideration. The science of this product is very complex in and of itself. We have a product that changes the more it sits outside, just at ambient temperature. So the product itself, as a botanical product, is changing. It's dynamic. We can't really halt that. We need to understand the science of that. And then we need to understand the products that are going into the supply chain. How are they formed? What are they intending to do? And remember, this is really an agricultural commodity. The science that we're using for cannabis is no different than anything else. It's just a little bit more complex in some areas. We're doing all of this. I think what we're doing is instead, we're all going to the University of Google or the University of the Internet to become educated. I don't think that that is the best place to go. I don't think that's the best place to understand what is happening with this product, where this product came from, what are the unique characteristics of this product. So we need to come back. We need to take the science, the physical science of the botanical product. We need to look at the product as part of the entire agricultural community as a commodity. We need to look at the regulations. Do they make sense to this product? We have regulations in place for wastewater. We have regulations in place for dog food. Are they the same regulations? No, they're different. They're unique to the dog food. They're unique to the wastewater. They're unique to the paint on your walls. And so we need to take a step back and look at the regulations and make sure they are specific to cannabis. What makes sense to cannabis? We look at things like Delta 8. I look at these products and I think, in all reality, I'm not an organic chemist by any stretch, but I'm guessing there's probably nothing wrong with Delta 8. However, the production of Delta 8, the synthetic production of Delta 8, leads a lot to be desired. We probably have a lot of side reactions in there and a lot of chemicals left in there that nobody's cleaning out. So when we hear about people having adverse reactions to Delta-8 products, more likely than not, if I had to guess, it would be from the junk we're leaving in that synthesis, in that synthetic process, more so than it is the actual Delta-8. Yet we don't have regulations that really speak to things like that. We don't have regulations that say when you are heating up a vape cartridge, then depending on the materials of that vape cartridge, you may be creating or leaching off metals. We're testing the cannabis at the front end of that vape cartridge, but we're not testing the chemistry that happens in process. And a lot of those in-process things result in adverse effects, and we're not looking at those. So those are some of the things that we've learned about recently in our recent cannabis history. And those are the things that reform needs to take a look at. And again, it's not just one entity, it's across the board. And yes, we do need some standard test methods out there. Those standard test methods need to speak to the issue at hand, and the regulations need to make sense, and science needs to make sense, and we need ethical behavior. And you know, it really is, you know, a whole. It's not just the sum of the parts that we need to be concerned about.
True, so true. All right, so thank you for that breakdown. And as we wrap up our discussion, we'd like to know if you have any advice for the industry stakeholders. So, for example, how can laboratories operate and provide results that consumers can trust? And on the other hand, how can consumers ensure they're getting what they're paying for and consuming a safe product?
You know, it really hurts my heart to say that the industry as a whole, definitely not everybody, but the industry as a whole has really revealed its worst side. We have some ugliness, and we're showing it. We've shown it. Cheating and bad players are all around us. It hurts my heart to say that. And sadly, I don't believe that there's an infrastructure in place right now to ensure that customers know what they're getting. I think that laboratory testing by some people, some folks, is exceptional, and I would stake my reputation on them. And on others, it's like, nope, I think I'll pass. And unfortunately, we really don't have safety claims out there. Our regulations say that they're for safety, but we don't really have any safety clauses. We haven't done any safety experiments. We don't have any thresholds. We don't have tolerances. So safety, consumer safety, is sort of a catch-all, and in the industry, cannabis industry, it really doesn't have any substance to it. So we have to look at what's on the labels. We are using our judgment based on what's in those labels. Again, it comes back down to regulations and the whole myriad of issues that we've been talking about this whole time we've been together. So again, coming back to what we just talked about, reform is desperately necessary. And unfortunately, to your current question, what about products that consumers can trust? I don't have a straight answer for you. I really don't. I really wish I could. And my friends call me all the time. Hardly a week passes with a, hey, Sue, can you give me some advice about this? And I say, no, I really can't. My only advice is you can't trust this and you can't trust that. Fortunately, and I'm really pleased to say that the FDA, although they are not regulating the cannabis industry, they do regularly go in and evaluate claims on cannabis and cannabis-derived product labels. So they have sent out warning letters to people, to manufacturers who make false label claims like, hey, this CBD will make you fall asleep and you will have a sound sleep. No, those have not been tested. They have not been attested to. And so claims like that, the FDA will step in and say, you need to take this off your shelf, or you need to change the label. This is a false label claim. So right now, I would tell people before you go buy a product, go to the FDA website and see if there have been any citations or any warnings to some of the products that you're thinking about. Right now, that is really the one stopgap that we have. As far as infrastructure for the overall safety of our products, I personally, again, my opinion, don't believe that that infrastructure is there.
Right. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. As you've pointed out, without a robust infrastructure, ensuring trustworthy results and safe products remains a complex issue. As we draw our discussion to a close, Dr. Audino, I want to take a moment to extend our appreciation for sharing your thoughts and enriching this conversation today. Your insights have been truly enlightening.
Well, thank you very much. I know I may have sounded a bit negative about some of the unfortunate parts of this industry. On the flip side of that, I'm also very hopeful. Again,
Right.
I come back to the humanity and well intentions of all of the players, of everybody out there. And I believe that there is a tremendous amount of hope. And I believe that there is a tremendous future for good products to reach our customers and our consumers. And this is not going to happen without people like yourselves allowing people like me to come in and talk about this. And thank you for your interest, and thank you for the opportunity to share my observations.
Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Audino. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We hope you found the discussion informative and engaging. Your opinion matters greatly to us, so do share your feedback on this podcast with us at support@cloudlims.com. If you have any questions regarding the topic of the podcast today, or if you're looking for a reliable LIMS, you can reach us at 1-302-789-0447 or send an email to support@cloudlims.com. Bye for now.